Welcome to the Deep Dive, the shortcut you need to be truly well-informed. Today, our mission is laser-focused on perhaps the most consequential geopolitical figure of the 21st century, Vladimir Putin. We are tracing his path meticulously, navigating the complex biography of, well, an obscure mid-level KGB agent who rose to become the global autocrat responsible for launching Europe's largest land war since the 1940s. This deep dive is built entirely on a detailed stack of source materials, covering his youth in Soviet Leningrad, the seismic shock of the Soviet collapse, his nearly impossible political ascent through the chaos of the 1990s, and his decades of defining foreign policy and military decisions from Chechnya right through to Ukraine.
And for you, the learner, the central inquiry we must hold throughout this discussion is not just what Putin did, but, why he succeeded so completely. Is Putin a genuinely revolutionary figure who fundamentally shaped modern Russia in his own image? Or is he simply the latest, maybe the most durable manifestation of a centuries-old Russian political cult, one defined by strongman rule, autocracy, and an unwavering belief in centralized imperial power?
Okay, let's unpack this. We begin in the city known then as Leningrad, October 7th, 19... And right from the start, his lineage tells a story. Full name, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. It's purely East Slavic. This detail, it seems small, but it immediately distinguishes him from previous strongmen who ruled Russia like, say, the Georgian Joseph Stalin.
Right. Putin, by birth, by heritage, he's Russian through and through, inextricably linked to the history of that city, St. Petersburg.
And his immediate family context is, well, it's textbook Soviet history, isn't it?
It really is. His father, Vladimir Sr., was a factor, a decorated veteran of the war against Nazi Germany, the Great Patriotic War. Right. He was, in essence, the perfect product of the Communist Revolution. But as the sources detail, this family unit was forged in immense tragedy.
Exactly. Vladimir was a late arrival. His mother, Maria, was already in her early 40s born. And before him, she and Vladimir Sr. had two older sons, Albert and Victor, who died young, one to disease and Victor tragically during the siege of Leningrad in 19...
That history of loss, of war, and just the grueling survival required by the communist system. It's essential context for the environment he grew up in. You can't understand him without it.
And then there's this fascinating thread, isn't there, connecting his family directly to the very founders of Soviet power.
Yes. What's fascinating here is Putin's paternal grandfather, Spiridon Putin. He was a personal chef to Vladimir Lenin himself back in the 1920s. And he didn't stop there. He went on cooking for the highest echelons of the Soviet upper brass, including Joseph Stalin, for decades.
Wow. So even in a humble trade like cooking, they were literally feeding the core power structure of the security state for, what, 2 generations?
Pretty much. It puts them right at the operational center, even if they were, politicians themselves.
And the speculation in the sources that Spiridon might have been involved in the NKVD, that's the forerunner of the KGB. That suggests a much deeper, maybe generations-long link. It's not just cooking.
It certainly raises questions. But despite this sort of proximity to power, their daily life was brutally hard in the 1950s. They lived in a cramped communal Leningrad apartment. Sources mention rats, an injured father trying to hold things together.
Right, living in those tough drawer, those enclosed apartment courtyards. That fosters a certain worldview, doesn't it?
It does. The sources suggest this environment taught him early on that life was a challenge in which everyone needed to fight to come out on top. You had to be tough, or you'd just be consumed. Basic survival.
Yeah, but it's crucial to put that personal hardship against the backdrop of massive national optimism, right?
Absolutely. He grew up amidst a genuine economic boom. After the devastation of the war, the 1950s and 60s saw Soviet GDP growth rates averaging over 7%.
Doubling the economy by the time he was a teen.
Exactly. This created a profound sense of national resurgence, this feeling of apparent Cold War success. The sources describe it as a kind of national rebirth, a feeling that Russia was finally, realizing its promised strength on the world stage.
So you've got this mix, personal, desperate toughness, combined with immense national pride.
It's a potent psychological foundation. Education-wise, he was apparently talented, intelligent, but also a bit of a troublemaker. Excelled at sports, particularly judo.
Martial arts, that physical discipline, seems like a recurring...
Very much so. After high school, he did technical training, focused on chemistry, about magnets, I think.
Right, before getting into Leningrad State University to study law.
And even there, his focus was telling. Not simple civil law, but the overlap. Political, legal, economic issues in international affairs, setting his sights high early on.
And of course, joining the Communist Party. That was just required for any ambitious career track in the Soviet system.
A prerequisite, no way around it. And it was during those 5 years of university, the sources say, he connected with Anatoly Sobchak.
Sobchak, the liberal legal scholar.
Yeah, who would later become this indispensable mentor, a crucial non-KGB political connection that would basically save his career when the whole Soviet Union eventually fell apart.
Okay, so 1975, he graduates and immediately enters the 401st KGB training school in Leningrad, realizing that child.
Yeah, the sources suggest that initial spark came from those, romanticized images of Soviet spies on TV shows like The Sword and the Shield.
Yeah.
Seeing himself as a heroic protector of the state, he apparently later saw himself as the ideal product of the Soviet educational and vocational believed in it.
His career path for the next 10 years sounds pretty standard, though. Steady, but not spectacular. Training, promotions, lots of death.
Well, the KGB was a massive bureaucracy, but then in 1985, he gets his quote-unquote big break, a major foreign posting to Dresden, East Germany.
The irony being he arrives just as the system he'd devoted his life to begins its, terminal.
Precisely. And the economic context here is absolutely vital. As you said, the boom years were long gone. By the mid-'80s, the Soviet economy had been stuck in deep stagnation for over a decade. The central planning system just couldn't keep up with the West, especially after the oil shocks in the 70s.
And add to that the psychological drain of the war in Afghanistan.
Oh, definitely. Russia's Vietnam, they call it. 10 years, dragging on, sapping resources, destroying morale. It shattered that myth of Soviet military invincibility, especially for agents like Putin watching from the sidelines in Dresden.
And then Mikhail Gorbachev tries to save
Glasnost and perestroika. Yeah, but in vassal states like East Germany, the sources are clear, these policies had the exact opposite effect.
How so?
Well, Glasnost, that push for openness, meant agents like Putin in Dresden were suddenly forced to file reports detailing the catastrophic failures, the growing unrest. They knew the system couldn't control the information anymore. And the local East German regime, they felt abandoned by Moscow. Their whole power structure was shaking violently. It must have been terrifying for a committed intelligence operative who truly believed in the system's strength.
And their worst fears were confirmed pretty dramatically with the fall of the Berlin Wall, November 1989.
That was it, the signal of total rapid collapse of Soviet influence across Central and Eastern Europe.
And this, you argue, is the absolute key worldview shift for listeners to get.
It's the singular most important takeaway, yes. Putin returns to Russia in 1990. The USSR is literally about to shatter into 15 independent countries by 1991. He did not, and the sources suggest he never has, viewed the collapse of the Soviet Union as a final, legitimate political event. For him, it was an historic aberration.
A moment of weakness.
Exactly. A moment of weakness that allowed foreign influences and, internal traitors to dismantle the Russian state.
So his future goal was set right then and there, the reconstitution of Russian rule over these newly independent nations, which he saw purely as lost provinces.
Lost provinces, taken during a moment of national insanity. That framing, that viewpoint, it dictates almost every single subsequent foreign policy action he takes.
Which explains his controversial exit from the KGB in 91. There's this duality.
Right. Some rumors suggested maybe mild sympathy for anti-communist elements, but his practical action, utterly loyalist. He played a key role, the sources say, in destroying or transporting Soviet and KGB records out of East Germany back to Russia, making sure crucial state secrets didn't fall into the hands of the new liberal German government.
He was a professional, even in collapse, navigating it with a singular focus on state security, protecting the apparatus.
Exactly.
Okay, so he returns to St. Petersburg. What's the first move?
He immediately leverages his connection, renews his relationship with Anatoly Sobchak, remember him? His old law professor.
Who by now, summer of 91, had become the mayor of the newly renamed city.
Correct. And this was Putin's first critical act of political survival. He gets folded into Sobchak's patronage network, spends 5 critical years as a rising mid-level official. It was basically an apprenticeship in city administration, learning how to manage corruption, licenses, political deals in that, wild, chaotic environment of post-Soviet Russia.
Almost like the Wild West.
In many ways, yeah. But his real, breathtaking ascent began in 1996 with a transfer to Moscow. This is where he goes from local apparatchik to national power broker.
And here's where it gets really interesting, as the outline says. His new assignment, a senior role in the distribution of state assets.
Which the sources correctly identify as one of the largest land and asset transfers in human history. Just stop and think about the scale of that for a second.
It's mind-boggling. They weren't just privatizing a few bakeries.
They were liquidating the assets of an entire industrialized superpower. Oil fields, gas pipelines, steel mills, communications networks, massive tracts of land. The value transferred was astronomical.
But the crucial insight here, according to the sources, is how Putin exploited that role. He wasn't necessarily getting rich himself.
Not primarily, no. He was accumulating political currency. By managing the sale of state industries, the issuance of crucial licenses, he was literally deciding which former Soviet factory manager or which connected, entrepreneur would become the next billionaire oligarch.
Right. So he knew who was getting rich, how they got rich, and what favors they owed.
Exactly. This network of obligation of IOUs, that was his true power.
Right.
It allowed him to build vital political alliances, moving way beyond Sobchak's patronage into the highest federal levels under a weakening Boris Yeltsin.
And the climb was just meteoric after that.
Unbelievably fast. By 1997, he's deputy chief of the presidential staff. That sounds bureaucratic, but in Russia, the presidential staff is everything.
The gatekeeper role.
Totally. Controls access to the president, manages information flow, accumulates vast informal power. He was now the gatekeeper to the Kremlin itself.
Which sets him up for that next leap in 1998. Logically, maybe, but still unprecedented.
Head of the FSB, the main successor agency to the KGB. Think about that. He went from being a former regional agent to controlling the entire state surveillance and security apparatus in less than 7 years.
It sent a clear signal, didn't it? The security state was back.
It absolutely did. And finally, in 1999, Yeltsin names him one of 3 deputy prime ministers. By then, Yeltsin was suffering badly from alcoholism. He desperately needed a competent, clean-cut successor.
Someone who could stabilize the economy, stamp out the lawlessness of the 90s.
And Putin fit the bill perfectly. He projected competence, order, control, exactly what Russia seemed to crave after a decade of chaos.
Yeltsin eventually endorsed him, sealed the deal.
Yep, Putin won the presidential election on March 26, 2000. Comfortable victory over the communist candidate, Gennady Zyuganov. He'd done it. Successfully leveraged the collapse of the state he once served into the leadership of the state that succeeded. Quite the maneuver.
Now, when he entered office in 2000, it's easy to forget how he was seen internationally at first.
Oh yeah, totally different perception. He was viewed as maybe a new species of Russian politician, a modernizer, potentially a democratic leader who the world hoped would eventually hand over power.
Finally breaking that centuries-old cycle of czarist and communist autocracy. That was the
hope. But he knew his power wasn't absolute yet. Constitutional limits still exist. His first task, really, was to monopolize control. And how did he do that? By dealing with the new economic reality.
The very people who'd gotten rich during the asset transfer he himself had managed.
Exactly. And the sources reveal a strategic masterstroke here. He didn't try to dismantle the oligarch class entirely. Instead, he cemented their existence, but only under one condition.
Total, unwavering political obedience.
Precisely. He essentially codified the relation. State power comes first. Private wealth serves the state. Or rather, serves him.
And he wasn't afraid to make examples of those who didn't get them.
No. Chilling, high-profile examples showing that disobedience carried a catastrophic personal cost, lose everything, go to jail, or flee into exile. By promoting obedience and crushing resistance, he guaranteed Russia's immense private wealth was subordinated to his state power.
And during his first 2 terms, up to 2008, he also had this incredible run of economic luck, as the sources call it.
Phenomenal luck. He came into office just as global oil and gas prices started their decade-long surge. Boon times for Russia's main exports.
Generating huge, unprecedented state revenues.
Which funded massive social programs, infrastructure projects. It created this renewed sense of national pride and stability, especially for the older generations who'd suffered through the crises of the 70s, 80s, and especially the disastrous 90s.
And that popularity became his shield, didn't it?
Absolutely. As the sources note, this immense public backing reduced internal resistance to his gradual but steady dismantling of Russia's nascent democratic institutions, things like media freedom, regional autonomy. He effectively bought social compliance with oil money.
But then came the constitutional hurdle, the 2-term, just like the U.S. system, couldn't serve more than 2 consecutive presidents.
Right. And this is where the spirit of the Constitution was first really obviously breached. In 2008, he wasn't quite ready, maybe to just ignore the law completely.
So he used the loophole.
The now famous loophole. He groomed his long-term ally, Dmitry Medvedev, to succeed him. Medvedev won the election, of course. But Putin simply switched jobs, became prime minister, the second most important office.
And the sources are pretty unanimous on this, right? Medvedev might have been portrayed as more liberal sometimes, but Putin was still calling the shots.
Calling the shots within government to an alarming degree is how one source puts it. It was basically rule by proxy, maintaining supreme authority without actually holding the top title.
And that move set a critical precedent, didn't it? The Constitution was now clearly flexible, secondary to the will of the strongman.
It showed the rules could be bent. So by 2012, he was ready to dispense with the proxy altogether. He returned to the presidency for a 3rd term, won a landslide victory, and from that point onward, he's never relinquished power. The consolidation of his personal control over the state, the economy, the security services, it was essentially complete by then.
Which brings us to this astonishing yet often hidden aspect of his power, his personal wealth. His official salary is tiny compared $100K, $150K a year. How do we square that with the speculation about his actual?
Well, this raises an important question, doesn't it? If you factor in decades of what the sources describe as mass embezzlement, the quiet acquisition of state assets through loyalists using the very systems he set up in the 90s, yeah, there's widespread speculation he might be one of the richest people on Earth, controlling billions, maybe tens of billions, in assets.
And the details that leak out are staggering, almost czarist in their
They really are. The sources mention things like that lavish Black Sea holiday retreat, reportedly worth tens of millions. Then there are the super yachts, one supposedly worth $500 million, fleets of luxury cars, helicopters, private planes.
It's incredible.
And crucially, this wealth is deliberately opaque. It's registered in the names of loyalists, childhood friends, held in complex offshore accounts.
Why? What's the purpose?
Well, two main purposes, according to the analysis. One, obviously maintaining the opulent lifestyle fitting a modern czar. But two, and this is critical, it acts as a massive exile fund. Insurance, should he ever be overthrown and forced to flee the country.
The fact that sources even seriously discuss the size of his exile fund tells you a lot about the inherent instability of that kind of power.
It really does. On the personal front, he keeps things intensely private. Divorced his wife, Ludmila Skrebneva, back in 2014.
They have 2 adult daughters, Maria and Katerina. Neither involved in politics?
Correct. But the media focuses heavily on those persistent rumors about his relationship with the retired Olympic gymnast Alina Kabaeva, who's much younger.
And the alleged sons born since 2015.
Right, which adds another layer of secrecy and maybe hints at some kind of non-political succession planning, or at least legacy building, to his whole profile. Very murky.
Okay, let's shift to ideology. If you look at the maps he's redrawn, the lands he's reclaimed, it's tempting to say he's just trying to rebuild the Soviet. But our deep dive suggests his ambition is actually far grander than that, tapping into something much older.
That's absolutely correct. His aim, based on his rhetoric and actions, isn't really Soviet revisionism. It feels much more like the reconstitution of the empire of the czars. The sources are pretty clear. He doesn't model himself on Brezhnev or Khrushchev. He reveres and explicitly models himself on Peter the Great.
Peter the Great. Why him specifically? What's the connection?
Well, think about what Peter the Great did in the 18th century. He fundamentally transformed Russia, defeated the Swedes, made Russia a dominant European naval power, and crucially, symbolically, moved the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg, Putin's hometown. Putin sees himself, it seems, following that exact path.
Yeah.
Asserting Russia's rightful place in the world after the humiliation of the 1990s, strengthening the military, focusing state attention on the Baltic and Black Seas. His policies, from the focus on naval power to his long-term tenure goals, arguably represent a kind of modernizing autocracy, precisely in the manner Peter the Great pioneered.
And this ties into his preferred method for dealing with direct political opponents. It's chillingly specific.
Death by poison, often using sophisticated military-grade nerve agents like Novichok. It's become a hallmark, a signature of his rule.
It's effective, obviously, but it's also deeply symbolic. State terror.
Absolutely. The purpose isn't just removal, it's intimidation. It's a clear state. The state can reach anyone, anywhere, with complete impunity.
We saw it with Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in England in 2018.
Yes, and most importantly, with his foremost domestic critic, Alexei Navalny. Navalny survived the poisoning attempt in 2020. Incredible.
But his brave return to Russia led straight to his arrest and ultimately his death in that Arctic prison in February 2020.
Putin eliminated internal dissent, not through messy public trial, but through the precise, terrifying application state cold and cap.
Which brings us right back to that central analytical question we started. Is Putin a symptom of Russian political culture, or did he fundamentally shape? Where did the sources land?
Well, this gets into that critical question about historical determinism, doesn't it? If we connect this to the bigger picture, you really have to look much further back than just the Soviet era. Russia's political culture, historically speaking, has overwhelmingly favored autocracy, strongmen, and the pervasive use of state terror, pretty much regardless of the official system of government.
The sources remind us about the Oprichniki, right? Ivan the Terrible's private police back.
Exactly. Arguably the first major European security service devoted solely to enforcing the Tsar's personal will through terror, centuries ago.
And when the Bolsheviks took power,
they just replaced the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, with the Cheka, then the NKVD, then the KGB. The structure, the function, remained remarkably consistent.
So when Gorbachev attempted to genuinely reform this culture in the late 80s, trying to usher in that liberal, forward-looking future
That reform failed completely. The Russian political system, faced with the chaos of the 90s, reverted to its historical default setting. It snapped back.
So the argument is Putin isn't really a revolutionary figure who bent Russia to his will.
The argument is more that he's a continuation, a logical outcome, perhaps, of a political history stretching back hundreds of years. He succeeded precisely where Gorbachev failed, because he understood, maybe intuitively, maybe strategically, that the deep-seated political culture of the country still demanded a czar, a strong hand.
So he's the latest incarnation of the strongman ruler Russia's system seems destined to produce.
You could certainly argue that. He's history's man, in that sense, not necessarily a man who defied history. He swam with the current, not against.
Okay, so if his rule is about reconstituting that czarist empire, his time in power has naturally been one of almost perpetual war, as the sources put it, all focused on reversing that historic aberration of 91.
Right. Reasserting Russian control over lost territory. And the first major test of this imperial ambition came in the goal, established total Russian hegemony there.
Starting with Georgia. Relations deteriorated rapidly as Georgia started looking west.
Exactly. Georgia, one of the most northern Caucasus states, began pursuing pro-Western policy, seeking closer ties with NATO and the EU. This was unacceptable to Moscow.
The friction point became those two separatist territories, Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
Correct. As tensions escalated, Russia used alleged Georgian aggression in South Ossetia as a pretext. Open warfare broke out in August 2008. Georgia, a small country, was quickly overrun by the Russian military.
It was a short, sharp demonstration of force. Very quick.
Very. The sources highlight the speed. Foreign powers, notably France under President Sarkozy, had to scramble to broker a ceasefire.
And the outcome.
The formal result was the creation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia as quasi-independent, autonomous regions. But let's be clear. As the source, this was just a way of formalizing Russia's seizure of territory. In reality, they became Russian client provinces, completely dependent on Moscow.
And this was the same model he'd already used in Chechnya, wasn't it? Installing Ramzan Kadyrov, that loyalist autocrat, to run the region on Russia's behalf after brutal wars.
Precisely the same model. Crush resistance, install a loyal proxy, maintain control. Did that success in Georgia essentially give him the confidence, the playbook he needed for the biggest prize, for Ukraine?
It seems highly likely. The Georgian conflict was a successful, relatively low-cost dress rehearsal. Should the West wouldn't intervene militarily, but Ukraine was always the grand prize.
It's the largest post-Soviet state, culturally and historically intertwined with Russia, but increasingly looking west. Throughout the 2000s, ordinary Ukrainians watched neighbors like Poland, Estonia, Lithuania join the EU and NATO and saw the benefits.
Economic growth, security.
Exactly. The desire for closer integration with the West just became irresistible for a large part of the population.
And the critical turning point, the flashpoint, was late 2013.
Yeah, the Ukrainian leader at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, was literally days away from signing a key EU association, but under intense pressure from Putin, he backed out at the last minute.
Putin saw any Western encroachment into Ukraine, especially something formal like an EU, as an existential threat to Russia's sphere of influence.
Absolutely. And that withdrawal by Yanukovych triggered the mass protests, the Euromaidan Revolution, which eventually forced Yanukovych to flee to Russia in early 2014.
And Putin responded immediately, using the Georgian playbook, but on a much bigger scale.
Instant Russian troops, the little green men, swiftly moved into the Crimean Peninsula. It was annexed formally by Russia in March 2014 after a sham referendum. Simultaneously, Russian troops, weapons, and resources poured into eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region, specifically Donetsk and Luhansk, to support separatist proxies who declared independence.
So for the next 8 years, from 2014 to early 2022, Putin maintained this sort of fiction, didn't he? That it was purely an internal Ukrainian conflict, that Russia was just supporting local separatists fighting a Western-backed regime in Kiev.
He did. He participated in the Minsk negotiations, which resulted in fragile ceasefires that never really held, froze the conflict but didn't resolve it.
But all the while, the sources confirm, Ukraine was moving steadily closer to NATO, even enshrined the goal of membership in its national constitution.
And for Putin, who views NATO expansion as this fundamental betrayal dating back to the promises allegedly made in the 1990s, that was the ultimate red line, the final provocation. It set the irreversible stage, in his mind, for the full-scale invasion in February 2022.
So that February 2022 invasion, it wasn't just a sudden reckless, was it? The sources suggest it was rooted in a very calculated, deeply cynical, grand strategy.
That's right. And central to that strategy was the so-called energy weapon. Yeah. This was years.
The long-term plan was to achieve maximum leverage over Europe through energy dependence, making them reliant on Russian gas and oil.
Exactly. The completion of the Nord Stream I pipeline directly connecting Russia and Germany in 2011 was a key key piece of Germany, the economic engine of the EU, became hugely reliant on cheap Russian gas, and similar dependencies spread across the continent.
And the timing of the invasion itself, that wasn't random either.
No, meticulously chosen, the sources argue. It coincided with the peak of the post-COVID-19 inflation crisis in the West. Governments had spent trillions on pandemic support. Economies were already stressed. Energy prices were already rising.
So Putin calculated that if he invaded Ukraine and cut off gas supplies to Europe,
he'd trigger an economic catastrophe, massive energy inflation, industrial collapse, potentially social unrest, which he believed would force Western populations to demand their governments abandon Ukraine just to get the gas turned back on.
And he thought he could finance a quick, decisive war in Ukraine.
Capture Kyiv within weeks, overrun the east and south down to Odessa,
while simultaneously just rerouting his oil and gas exports to other global buyers like China and India, mitigating the financial hit.
It was a bold economic gamble, hugely cynical. But his military calculation proved fundamentally flawed, disastrously flawed.
He expected a quick victory. What went wrong?
Well, the performance of the Russian military itself was probably the biggest shock to us. The sources highlight this recurring theme. Russian military culture has this long history of underperforming expectations, marked by incredibly high losses, poor logistics, rigid command structures.
We saw it against Japan in 1905, Finland in 1939.
Afghanistan in the 1980s. Even in World War II, the victory came at an almost unimaginable human cost. The 2022 invasion, sadly, was no different. The systemic problems persisted.
The swift, sharp war plan, capture Kyiv, decapitate the government, it failed almost immediately.
Collapsed within weeks. Due to terrible logistics, trucks running out of fuel, extremely stiff and well-motivated Ukrainian resistance, underestimated badly and crucially the years of Western training and the rapid injection of advanced Western military hardware, like anti-tank missiles.
So the initial assault on Kyiv was repulsed by the end of March 2022, forcing a major strategic pivot.
Exactly. The war shifted focus to the east and south. It quickly devolved into a brutal attritional siege war, World War I style, exemplified by the horrific siege of Mariupol from February to May 2022. That siege was strategically successful for Russia. In one sense, it created that crucial unbroken land bridge between the Donbass and Crimea along the Sea of Azov.
But the human cost was immense. The city was leveled.
Devastated. And the nature of the warfare, the sheer brutality, led directly to widespread international condemnation. Atrocities committed by Russian forces, like the mass killings of civilians discovered in Bucha after the Russians retreated in March 20.
Over 450 bodies found there.
Horrific. Events like Bucha solidified the international view of Putin not just as a despot, which was already clear, but unequivocally as a war criminal.
And those actions, those perceptions, they've had real, tangible consequences for him globally, haven't they?
They have. Russia was already suspended from the G8 back in 2014 after the Crimea annexation. But more significantly, in March 2023, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, issued an arrest warrant for Putin himself.
For the illegal deportation of thousands of Ukrainian children to Russia.
Yes. And that warrant severely limits his international travel. He effectively can't attend any major global summit hosted by countries that are signatories to the ICC statute, which includes most of Europe and Latin America. It makes him a pariah in much of the world.
Now, while Putin seems masterful at crushing any sort of mild anti-war dissent within Russia itself, using propaganda, repression, fear, his power faced one major, very public physical test from within the security. June 2023, the Prigozhin Revolt.
Ah, yes. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the peculiar, outspoken founder of the Wagner mercenary group, which had done a lot of Russia's dirty work, the heavy lifting, in places like Syria, the Sahel region of Africa.
And in Ukraine itself, especially around Bakhmut.
Absolutely. Prigozhin became increasingly and very publicly critical of the war effort, specifically targeting the established military leadership, Shoigu and Gerasimov, accusing them of incompetence, corruption, starving his troops of ammunition.
And then in June 2023, he went from words to action, launched a de facto revolt, seized the major southern military hub of Rostov-on-Don,
and sent an armed convoy rapidly advancing towards Moscow. It was astonishing how quickly it happened, how little resistance they initially met.
And the sources reveal that when Putin finally appeared on live television to denounce Prigozhin's actions as treason, he looked different.
He looked, as one source put it, extremely fake. There's a genuine nervousness, a flicker of uncertainty that was really unprecedented in his decades of carefully curated strongman.
For a moment, that facade of absolute invulnerability seemed severely cracked. It reminded everyone that while he controlled the state, he was still, ultimately, just one man.
Right. Then the revolt was bizarrely called off at the last minute. Supposedly through mediation by Belarus's leader Lukashenko, Prigozhin ordered his forces to turn back just miles from Moscow.
But the story didn't end there.
No. 2 months later, August 2023, Prigozhin and his top Wagner lieutenants were killed when their private jet mysteriously crashed or was possibly shot down north of Moscow.
The message seemed pretty clear.
Extremely clear. Challenges to the strongman personal rule, direct challenges, will not be tolerated, regardless of past service or usefulness. The incident ultimately confirmed just how much stability in Russia hinges entirely on Putin's personal command and his willingness to eliminate threat.
Okay, let's look at the current geopolitical dynamics. Mid-2020s, the situation feels incredibly fluid, unstable.
It really is. We've seen, for instance, U.S. aid to Ukraine essentially collapse following the election of a Republican government that argues the war is not a core American problem, that Europe should carry the burden.
Which has placed enormous pressure on the European Union and Britain, right? Forcing them to drastically increase their own military and financial support just to try and fill that void left by the U.S.
It creates massive uncertainty for Kyiv and, frankly, for European security planning as a whole. It's a huge shift.
And then you add in the complex situation with Donald Trump. There seems to be this mix of apparent admiration for Putin, but also annoyance over what Trump perceives as Putin's stalling tact, preventing some kind of quick deal.
Right. The planned summit between the two leaders in Alaska is scheduled for mid-August 2025, according to the source. That's going to be a critical flashpoint. It will likely define the next phase of the war and U.S.-Russia relations. Huge stake.
What about peace? Are negotiations actually happening?
Well, talks have taken. In various locations, Riyadh is Istanbul. But the sources express deep skepticism about any real breakthroughs happening soon. A key indicator. Russia consistently fails to send top-level, empowered diplomats to these talks.
Sending signals they're not serious.
It suggests they're not ready for genuine compromise. Both sides, privately, probably acknowledge that Ukraine will likely have to make large-scale land concessions eventually, certainly Crimea, probably most of Donetsk and Luhansk, territories Russia has effectively controlled since 2014 anyway.
But the thornier issues remain huge obstacles.
Massive. Things like Ukraine's potential future NATO membership.
Yeah.
Russia will never accept it. And the presence of any kind of future European or international peacekeeping force on Ukrainian soil. These are sticking points that seem almost insurmountable right now, preventing any final settlement.
So looking ahead, what are Russia's likely future ambitions beyond Ukraine?
Well, the analysis suggests the goal likely remains total domination of the Caucasus region, finishing the job started in Georgia, and continuing to destabilize former Soviet spheres of influence, places like Moldova, maybe the Balkans, potentially leveraging allies like Hungary and Serbia, keeping those regions off balance.
What about further military action, minor border grabs?
It's plausible, the sources concede. Maybe minor border adjustments or incursions against, say, Finland or Estonia, if the West is massively distracted elsewhere, maybe by a major conflict over Taiwan, for example. Opportunism is always a factor.
But the idea of him seizing Poland or all of the Baltic states?
That, the sources argue, is probably overblown.
The war in Ukraine, for all its brutality, demonstrated Russia's significant limitations in prosecuting sustained, large-scale offensive operations against a determined, well-armed opponent. They just don't have the conventional capability for that kind of massive conquest, right?
Plus the economic disparity. Exactly. Russia's entire economy is, as the sources put it, minuscule, roughly the size of Spain's, compared to the combined economic and industrial might of the European Union, let alone NATO. Any major attack further west would likely constitute a catastrophic military and economic overstretch for Russia.
Which brings us finally to the great open question. Succession. Putin is 72 as of 2025. Healthy, by all accounts, but he's groomed no clear political successor.
No, he's consistently played potential heirs off against each other, promoting people like Medvedev, then demoting them, shuffling the deck constantly to ensure supreme singular power remains only with him. No obvious number two exists.
And this sets up a potentially dangerous historical parallel.
Yes, specifically the one that followed Joseph Stalin's death in 1953. Stalin also refused to name a successor. The result was a divided succession crisis, years of governmental split, infighting between rival factions like Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev. It took years for Khrushchev to consolidate power.
So the sources suggest the future of Russia, and by extension Eastern Europe, remains extremely unstable.
Extremely unstable, not just because of the ongoing war, but because of this fundamental open question about who or what comes after Putin. And that instability is made even more precarious by the very real possibility that he could rule for another 15 or 20 years, given his current age and health. It leaves a huge question mark hanging over the entire region.
So what does this all mean? Where does our deep dive leave us? It really confirms this crucial duality. Putin's rise was undeniably meteoric, almost unbelievable. He ruthlessly exploited the chaos of the post-Soviet collapse. He leveraged immense economic luck with oil price, and he brilliantly capitalized on the failure. Predecessor Yeltsin, no question, he's a master political operator. But his long-term goal, the driving force, it isn't the reconstitution of communism. It's the reconstitution of czarist imperial power, drawing on a much older, deeper ideology of Russian exceptionalism and historical grievance.
And we have to stress the synth. You've got Putin, the hunting, root capitalized that came his way. But you also have him operating within this centuries-old political cult, one that, regardless of whether you call it Tsarism, communism, has always, almost without fail, favored the strongman, the power of the secret police, and the centralized authority radiating from Moscow. He is, in many ways, the ultimate product of his nation's history. He fits the mold.
Yeah, the source material meticulously traces that line of authoritarian, from the Oprichniki-backed century through Stalin's terror, right up to the modern FSB and the methods of dark threat. And this leaves us with a provocative thought. Could modern Russia only was someone like him almost inevitable? Or could the vision of a different Russia, a liberal, forward-look, that ambitious dream Gorbachev had, the one that seemed to flicker briefly in the early 90s before dying out, could that ever truly have been realized? What, in the end, is the determinant weight of its history, grained political, or is it the strength of individual will, the choices made by leaders forge a path? That's